Chupchage, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future, and our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. I'd like to welcome our host today, Daniel from Sustainability and Diversity Student Association. He's going to be giving us a little workshop on composting.
Yeah, so hello everybody. So I'm going to start off by just talking a little bit about myself, and to do so, I shall share my slides over here. So let's get this going. Here we go. So just if you, Emily can confirm that you see the slides and that they're nice and well up there. Perfect. Thank you. So we're going to have a Vermi-compost 101 workshop here in which I will talk about and demonstrate basically how to build your vermicompost and how to work it out. So my name is Daniel, and I'll be accompanied by these two worms here. We have Wiggly and Crawly, and they'll just have these little chat heads along the way. They're really just meant to accompany us in this little workshop. Oh, there you go. So just a little bit about myself. So basically, I'm an ecology student at Concordia, so soon to be graduate. And basically, I really love ecology. It's something that's been my passion for only so many years. And I love sharing this passion as well with people. And I love finding ways to integrate ecology into our everyday lives, because I feel like once we do that, we can kind of understand more the connections that we have with nature. I'm really happy as well to be working towards a master's very soon. I'm doing my applications right now, so fingers crossed for that. So as a little overview of the presentation, I'll be talking about a few main points. So first of all, what is vermicomposting? I'll also give a quick introduction to worm ecology, so you kind of understand the basics of how worms function, how they live. Then I'll give you a step-by-step introduction on how to build your vermicompost bin, so you can do this at home, give you some management tips and tricks, and then basically explain how to harvest your soil. Just want to let you know, though, that there is some explicit content in this presentation, but don't worry, I'll let you know. So if you're one of those that prefer not to see explicit content, you can just close your eyes or fast forward through the presentation a little bit. This presentation is really meant to be informative, but also really fun. So my way of integrating teachings is really to make it entertaining a little bit, and just make it so everybody has a good time while we learn some fun worm facts. So the first question that we have is, what is a vermicompost? So a vermicompost is very, very simply composed of three elements. It's a compost, with worms in a bin. And there are many reasons to do this. The reasons that I particularly choose to do this is just to kind of feel a bit more connected with nature's natural cycles. It's also a nice science experiment to do at home. And in the end, the kind of products that you can either get a liquid fertilizer or you can get some really, really high quality soil. Now, another good reason to do this is to find an alternative to sending your food to the landfill. There's many compost programs that already exist, but having a vermicompost at home permits you to not only get the products for yourself, but also be part of this whole process. And honestly, that's a very exciting part of this. So what exactly is wild soil? What's the goal here? Well, a vermicompost essentially can create what I like to call wild soil. So soil that has a high content of bacteria that are beneficial for the plants. So in the same way that bacteria are beneficial in your gut, bacteria are also really beneficial for plants because they're going to help them basically in their availability of nutrients. So we already have compost. Why include worms? That may be one question that we might have. Well, very essentially, they're just nutrient cycling masters, and they have many, many other functions as well. So one of them I talked earlier is to stimulate microbial activity. So the worms will be able to create an environment where there are beneficial microbes that can help plants afterwards gather the nutrients. They also help in soil formation and help to enhance the soil structure. And they also increase the water holding capacity of the soil by increasing the carbon content of it. So overall, what you get with worms is just a much quicker way of composting, and a way of composting that also integrates other qualities to the soil. And that's something that we definitely want, especially if you're a gardener and you want to have a high, rich quality soil. Vermicompost is definitely the way to go, because it can also be easily integrated at home. So again, we have our two worms here. We have Wiggly and Crawly. I'm not going to be reading the chat heads, but you're welcome to read them as I go through the presentation. So let's talk about worm ecology now. Worms are living beings, right? And they breathe through their skin. The only thing is they really need moisture to be able to breathe, but they also need oxygen. So what that means is that we need to create an environment for them that remains moist, but that is not too moist as to make it without any oxygen. So worms can also live about 2 to 3 years and can eat quite a big amount of food. If you have a small bin of 200 worms, you can feed them about 100 grams of organic waste per week. And if you have bigger bins of, say, 1,000 worms, you can almost have a full pound of organic waste per week. The only thing is that they like to stay in the soil. They don't really like light, whether it's artificial or sunlight. Okay, that's very important to notice. The second part is we're going to talk a little bit about reproduction now. So reproduction basically can happen about every 60 days. You can have a doubling of the population. And how it works is basically the worms will create these little, I guess, eggs or cocoons that you want to call. And these cocoons maybe look like a slightly translucent, tiny corn kernels, which is interesting. You might just find them through your soil. And how they do these cocoons is through reproduction. And you'll notice here on the top right picture, they have this kind of like a sort of a neck, or what we could assimilate as a neck, but that's actually their sexual organs. And it's by having a worm put its sexual organs with another worm's sexual organs that you will be able to create these cocoons. And that's how sexual reproduction works for worms. So this is the point where we have the explicit content. So again, if you want to just close your eyes for a few seconds, you may go ahead. If not, you may just enjoy the next slide. It's really just about worm reproduction. So, oh no, this is what it looks like. Basically, two worms that are mating, and a little image by Borat just for his second movie reference. So again, there's two types of worms, and just little comment here on Crawly. He says that it's atrocious and despicable. The reason he says that is not necessarily because of the reproduction per se. It's really just because somebody put a big flash on that picture, and because they don't like light or sunlight, you can imagine that must be the worst thing for them. They're just trying to reproduce, and somebody's completely ruining the environment for them. So don't do that in the future.
We got a question from Malcolm. Are all worms the same?
Oh, no, of course not. I mean, all worms are worms, but for vermicompost specifically, that's where we're going to have some differences. And I'm actually going to get into that right afterwards. There's some important distinctions to be made. You can't just go outside and grab a few worms and put them in your vermicompost and hope everything works right, because there's certain characteristics that makes that certain worm species are better for a vermicompost at home than others. In the same way that you wouldn't have a huge dog in a small apartment because it might not work well with your environment. Okay. So again, this is the slide where we're talking about the different compost worms. There's different species that exist. The ones that I recommend to kind of look into are the ones that you can find at wormbox.ca. I've been mainly working with the red wrigglers just because they're really, really easy to work with, and they have certain characteristics that make them better compost worms. So specifically, the kind of things we're looking for a compost worm is that they don't burrow much. You don't want a worm that goes like 1.5 meters deep in the soil naturally, because if they do that, well, I mean, you might have to have a really big bin to support that. Second thing, they have to be able to tolerate small environments with big populations. Certain worms rather not be compacted in a small space, and that might mean that they might try and evade. You don't want that when you have a vermicompost in your kitchen. Your roommates or your family might get a bit angry if that happens, but don't worry, because with red regulars, that's not the case. They like to stay in their environment and be happy, and that's why I choose them. And you also want worms that are really quick at eating your food scraps, so you can just, go through your food scraps and create better soil as a process. There are also other types of worms that are available to be bought. Personally, I haven't experimented with those yet. I'd rather just stick with red regulars just because they're a lot more common and they're also cheaper. So again, there's two types of worms. Yeah, Wiggly's quite excited for here, and Crawly's a little bit scared just because they may feel like they might be left out, and we don't want that to happen. So to move on here, I'm going to explain to you what exactly we're looking for the Vermi Squad complex. So this is a name that I've kind of given to their house, and when you create your vermicompost bin, you really want it to be a space where they have everything they need so they can just live in their housing complex and just stay there and be happy. Okay, so the first thing I want to start off with is a 40 to 60 liter opaque bin. It's super important that it's not transparent because, again, they don't like light, right? So you want to create a dark environment that they can be in. However, they do need oxygen. So you need to drill some holes on the sides all the way through to be able to have some sort of little airflow. The bin can either be closed if it has enough holes, or it can be slightly open just to make sure that there's enough oxygen for them to live. Then we're going to have some wood chips or a mulch, which I use to place on the sides of the bin. And that, I'll show you later, helps to really just have a better environment for them. Then obviously we need a bunch of worms. And as we've seen before, you can kind of buy them through the website that I've shown. And if you're listening to this, you're also having a chance to actually win some. So I'd really recommend you check this out. Finally, we also need a medium. So using some old soil, in my opinion, is one of the ways that you can create that. Why use oiled soil? There are other mediums you can use, but usually a lot of us have, either a pot that has old soil and the plants aren't doing so well in it, or, we harvested, we took away all the plants that were from outside during the summer, and we might have some soil that we don't know what to do with. What's interesting is to take this older soil, so soil that's lost a bit of its nutrients, and put it in their vermicompost to kind of give it back some life, to add more bacteria to it and increase, again, its water holding capacity and other characteristics. Basically, let's turn, used soil into more productive and healthy soil. So this is a 5-step approach to have the vermicompost bin. So you're going to start off here on the left side with placing some bedding. So a bedding can be any type of shredded cardboard. You just want to place this at the bottom just to kind of create a little, a little environment, a little cover before they reach the bottom of the bin. It's also used to supplement their meals. So when the worms are a bit more hungry, they can come in and have a little bit of the bedding to eat, because yes, worms actually eat cardboard. It's one of the things that they love. Then you want to top that cardboard with some soil. You just put a certain amount, and you're going to add the wood chips or the mulch on the edges. And you kind of want to create the separation so that all along the edge of the bins, you have wood chips, and in the center, that's where you have all the soil. Now, the reason why you want to have mulch is because when you're watering the vermicompost, you can start by watering the edges first, and then adding a little bit of water towards the middle. The wood chips are good because they retain water really well, and so putting water directly onto them makes it so that the worms have a better environment to live in, rather than adding water directly to the soil, which might disturb them and maybe might make them feel like, okay, well, there's no more oxygen in this place, I need to move a little bit. once that you've added some mulch, it's iterative process. So you put soil, you add mulch on the edges, you put more soil, you add more mulch on the edges. So you add more soil and then more mulch. Once you've kind of completed this and it's, about 3/4 full, you just want to top it off with some more soil and make sure that you dig a few holes, make sure that the soil is moist before you put the worms, because again, they really need moisture to be able to breathe. So it's super important that you don't just add them to dry soil because, well, they won't live for long. And you also want to create in your housing complex, just prepare some food. Imagine coming into an apartment and there's already food in the fridge. How good does that feel? Well, it's the same thing for the worms. You want to place food scraps at different places, at different levels of the bin. So when they're exploring the bin and they're kind of getting used to this new environment, they're already able to, start living a good life. And to add a little garnish, I like to top my vermicompost with some leaves, just to recreate a little bit of a natural habitat for them. If you go in the forest, you'll see that there's always a top layer of leaves along. That also helps so that when you open your vermicompost bin, the light that shines through, well, the worms can easily just kind of burrow behind the leaves and they won't really be disturbed by the light as much. Otherwise, are there any questions here?
I have some questions.
Yes.
So, is it true that like animals like bison, they enrich the soil similarly to worms?
There are many animals that work definitely to enrich the soil. So bisons are some of the animals that do so. Any but it has to be done in a managed way, in the sense that bison or any type of herbivore really that stay in only one spot. Sadly, what studies have shown is that they tend to like kind of degrade it. But if they're allowed to move from plot to plot, following natural rhythms or following a management plan that's kind of a bit more precise, then you can definitely get the best benefits from it. And it's the same thing for cows as well. If we use these grazers in a proper way, in an adequate way that doesn't just like kill all the vegetation, like sadly or most of our conventional systems do, then you definitely reap the benefits.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that is it that they increase carbon or that they need carbon, and what exactly was that? You said earlier that they're
For sure. Well, it's actually it all works through the worm feces, to be honest. And that's the beauty of it. It's a cycle. So the worm will, think of it just it's a worm, right? So the food will go in through its mouth, go through its digestive enzymes, where it will be able to break the food up a little bit more and add bacteria to it, which will also further break down the food and make it so that the nutrients in that I guess food scrap you would call it actually becomes useful for plants afterwards. So
the carbon is useful for the plants. Okay, right.
exactly.
Right.
I mean, having a higher carbon content soil helps because it makes it so that it has a higher water retention capacity, but it also helps. A lot of studies have shown that areas that are that have a higher plant diversity and basically have better soil conditions can grow better food, can grow more nutritious crops, either in amount or either in quantity or in quality. So yeah, that's one of the things that is interesting with the worms.
So last question.
Yes.
From me at least. You mentioned that I mean, this whole kind of how to take care of worms is very similar to like how you take care of plants, but you don't really experience the same visual like pleasures of like seeing a plant at home.
No, for sure.
Right, but they require similar attention. Like, you don't want to give them too much light. You want to make sure you water the soil. So how do you like what do you say to people who would say like, why would I do something like that?
Well, I mean, many people can have different reasons. Particularly for me, it was just because I don't want to put my food scraps to the landfill and I want to be able to get something out of it. also a lot of times, I mean, depending on the system, certain food scraps aren't, it's like the recycling system. Sometimes it's not perfect, but having it at home makes it so that you can, be the one who manages that. Um, what's really nice about this is the quality of the soil that you get afterwards, and the money that you save by doing so. If you're a person who loves plants, having a vermicompost system can really just be an addition to your whole goal, because you're using an end product, so something you won't be using afterwards, such as your food scraps, and you're literally adding life to your soil. And then your soil, if you want to add it to your tomato plants, if you want to add it to your ornamental plants, is just going to benefit the plant. And it's going to make it grow better, and be healthier, and stimulate basically a better microbial activity in your soil as well.
Right.
So if you're a bit reticent of starting a vermicompost bin for X reasons, don't worry. I'll give you all the management tips and tricks a bit later in this presentation, so that you really reap the most benefits from this, and also have a fun time while doing it.
Cool. Move it along.
Let's go. So, and this little part here. So, or just to finish off here, once we've added the leaves, made the whole housing complex fixed and have all the components that the worms need, then we're going to add the worms and we're going to let them settle. It's super important. Imagine when you're moving into a new apartment, you might be a bit unsettled. There might be some new things, you need to get used to them. And again, there's two types of reactions that the worms can have. Some are really interested to just go out and explore and kind of see, oh, okay, well, there's some food here. And other worms like a crawler here is wondering, when's the next meal? Again, once you're letting them settle, it's super important that you make sure that the soil stays moist, and you don't want to put too much food at the beginning. Okay, you want to maybe put food in maybe one, maybe two corners. Let them kind of go through that in a few days, check in on them, add some more food, maybe towards the middle or another corner of the bin. And that way, that kind of lets them explore the whole place and realize and make connections with other worms too, because that's super important. So in terms of food, we were talking about like food scraps, and this is what it would look like. Their complete breakfast looks like something that you wouldn't necessarily eat for yourself. It's rather just the end products of your cooking, and the best part is that they love this. It's something that they will absolutely adore you for and help you create thriving soil from these. So again, these beautiful gourmet displays, I like, when I'm cooking, I like to just have a little bowl on the side and I place all my food scraps in that bowl, so that once it's time to, well, clean around my cooking, I just take a few minutes and I will go feed my worms. It's very simple. You literally just either you take a glove or you take your hands. I don't mind to get dirty. And I just go down, move some earth, place the food scraps, and then just put the earth back. And over time, the worms will just go out, discover this new, area of food, love you for all the, beautiful gourmet food you're feeding them, and make some good soil out of that. So I showed you a little picture of food, but there are some guidelines for what to feed and what not to feed the worms. So what you really should be feeding the worms: fruits, vegetables. Give them everything that you got in that category. If you want to add eggshells, can be super beneficial, but it's important to rinse them and to also heat them up to make sure that there are no pathogens attached to it. Coffee grounds are also super good. Imagine all the coffee grounds. If you're throwing them to the garbage or putting them in a regular compost system, they are excellent for a vermicompost system. And dried plant matter or leaves, so if you have, plants in your apartment and you have some dying leaves or even a dead plant per se, just feed that to the worms, and who knows, maybe you even get a new plant that sprouts out. You'd be surprised by the amount of life, so non-worm life, that also comes about. A lot of times you'll see like little sprouts. So if you had a dead plant and you just put in your vermicompost bin, chances are that it will create roots and start growing again. So that might just be your hope, to give some more life to old plants that have deceased, and then do better next time. What you don't want to add to the worms is dairy products. You don't want to add any oils or any heavy fats. So in other words, cooked produce, I recommend you don't put that in your vermicompost bin. If you have something that's anything that's oil based, you want to avoid, just in terms of the smells that could come out of that. I'll give you some management tips for that, so it's not something to worry about normally. And then any plastics or metals or any stickers that you get from fruits and vegetables, super important that you don't add those. And also soap. If you rinse your vegetables, that's perfect. Just make sure that there's no soap into that because that kills the bacteria. So in terms of the preferred living conditions here, we talked about moisture, super, super important, but you don't want it to be, dripping. You don't want it to be too wet, because in those cases, basically there won't be enough oxygen in for the worms, sorry, and they won't be able to basically live correctly. You also want to have a pH balance. So I was talking about eggshells earlier. Those are super important if you want to add any citrus fruits to it. Usually what you can do is after you've washed and slightly baked your eggshells, so either in a mini toaster oven or when you're cooking something in the oven, just place them on a metal pot for a few minutes in the oven. That'll be enough. You can basically mix the citrus with the eggs, and that's going to balance the pH. Because if you add too much citrus, the worms won't like it. It's going to become too much of an acidic environment for them, and they might try and escape if it's really, really bad. But don't worry, that doesn't happen. If it's managed properly and you stick to the guidelines that I'm giving you here, the worms will be way happier to just stay into your bin, and that's going to be how they're going to be able to live their life. In terms of food amount, you want to keep it balanced. So it's really along the lines of start small and just add more. You don't want it to be too much at once, like I said earlier, because then they might be a little bit stuck. In terms of worm density, think amusement park, not a busy elevator. You don't want them to be squished in a tiny box and not really be able to move. You want to give them, like I said, a 40 or 60 liter box so they can move properly. If you want a smaller box, that's fine, but then you need to be mindful to not have as many worms or not give them as much food at a time. Otherwise, are there any other questions before I jump into here? Yes, Malcolm, go ahead.
You mentioned a few interesting things. One was, actually first, can any soil have the potential of becoming healthy soil?
That's a good question. Personally, the experience that I've had is I've always used soil that's been used either once, twice, or thrice to grow plants. But I've never used, very, how to say, dusty soil. So soil that basically has no life. But if you're adding that dusty soil to an existing complex, I wouldn't see why that wouldn't work. So if you have any soil that's like dried up and like, there's no richness to it, if you're adding that to something to a vermicompost bin that's already like a bit settled, then your chances are that it will, be able to reconvert itself and become better soil. But if that's your base medium to start your vermicompost bin, you might not have the water holding capacity that's required for the worms to be able to live correctly. So for example, if your soil is like either super dry, then the water when you add water to it, it's just kind of going to go on the side and the water is not going to absorb it. Or on the other end, if your soil is way too clumpy, then chances are that it's going to retain so much water in an unhealthy way, and so worms won't be able to live there. So it's about finding a balance between what kind of soil you're giving them. But again, if you add those, that less healthy soil over time to an existing worm bin, there should be no worries. They should just integrate and it will become better soil throughout.
Thank you. I have one more question. Does the soil get higher and higher? Like I cook every day, right? So if I start adding my food to this compost bin, I imagine it's gonna get high, or do the worms actually digest it and bring it back down?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So you're adding food, right? I'll tell you a bit more of how to make sure that you're adding it in a way that gets, is best for them.
Yeah.
But when you're adding food, essentially, over a week, 2 weeks, they're gonna start eating through that food, um, basically pooping out their nutrients, and then going for more food and etc. So although yes, you are adding food, they will just kind of eat it down. In the same way that if you go in a forest, there's only, there's so many leaves that fall every year. If there were no decomposers, well, all those leaves would just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate, and we'd be like trashed in so many leaves. But luckily, there are decomposers out there, and they will basically lower down that volume to an acceptable level. That makes life possible. So decomposers, amongst many, and worms are some of them, are really important for that.
Thanks.
No worries. So we're going to move on here in terms of the management here. So how can you max the benefits? The first thing is that you want to, check in on them. I like to cook, solid meals twice a week. That's me personally. So twice a week when I'm cooking, I'll go check in on them. There's no point of kind of checking in on them like every day, because a lot of times it takes a little bit of time. Say if you just fed them and you're like, oh, why aren't they eating the food? Well, it might take them a bit of time to get accustomed to that new food, or maybe you disturb them a little bit too much when you fed them with the food. So they're probably going to be a bit reticent, but you'll be surprised, a week later you open your bin, you're like, oh my God, like either the food's gone or they've moved it around, or worms can be quite surprising, but you need to give them the time to be able to surprise you. And you also want to serve them a gourmet and diverse diet. I like to think of myself when I'm giving them food is I'm like their specialty chef, right? So what I mean by that is you can mince the vegetables very, very small because, again, they're very, very small animals. So if you chop up the vegetables, it becomes easier for them to manage rather than if you kind of just throw like big pieces at them, it will be harder for them to eat. Nonetheless, it's still important to add some bigger chunks. And that's just because it can create the right kind of microhabitat for them, either to reproduce or to kind of have an environment where they will be more likely to kind of just eat here and there. So what I'm saying is that it's good to have mainly chopped vegetables or fruits or food scraps, and then have some peels, such as like an avocado peel, they really, really love. And if you maybe chop that maybe just in half or like in a quarter, and you put that in a vermicompost system, you'll be surprised that a lot of times they're going to have their cocoons there, or they're just going to kind of be hiding because it's a just preferred moisture spot for them. Whatever they find good in it, I'm not too sure yet. But I'm always surprised by how they tend to kind of stick to those bigger chunks, and want to kind of stay there. But again, most of your food should be chopped as much as possible to help them out. If not, it will just take a bit more time. And since you want to like rotate your food, especially if you're cooking often, then you want to chop it small so they are able to eat the food faster, and then you can feed them more, right? Because if there's too much food and you're adding more food, that can become one of the problems that I'll be talking about afterwards. But no worries, we'll talk about it so you won't make that mistake. In terms of tips and tricks, I like to see my vermicompost bin, so on the right here, as a layout, right, with the either 4 or 6 squares. And these are not necessarily lines that I draw in the soil, but rather kind of just have an idea of. And you can imagine that this could also kind of be the cover. So we have the vermicompost bin in the background, and what's on top here would basically be the cover, when you have it in your kitchen. What can be interesting is to maybe use some tape or any marker and just draw those lines on your cover, so that like that you're able to take some notes on which quadrant or which area you put your food for which day. And that's where it becomes more of a science experiment. If you just want to get a vermicompost without doing this, that's totally fine. But this will be able to give you some more information about, what food do your worms prefer, how fast are they able to eat it, and also know, what's approximately the distribution of, moisture content that they do the best in. For example, I've noticed that along the corners, so on the top edge, right, of the bin and the bottom edge of the bin, those are the areas where the soil tends to become a bit more dry. And that's because I leave my vermicompost slightly open, and for some reason, those two extremities become a bit more dry. So because I was able to do this, quadrat format, I was able to realize, okay, I should maybe when I water, put a bit more water in those two extremities, and therefore the worms are just going to be happier and are going to be able to go to the food that I place there. So I talked about moisture. Buying a $10 moisture meter for any store can be really helpful for that. They're really inexpensive. They don't require any batteries. You literally just stick them in the soil, wait a few seconds, and you get a reading. And you want to make sure that your soil stays in the green or blue zone. So not fully wet, but you want it to be nice and moist, right? So they can breathe properly. And yeah, do you have any questions about this part here for the management? All right, otherwise I'll keep going here. Thanks. So we were talking about the products that we have here. One of them that you can get is what we call a compost tea. So a compost tea is a little tea basically that you're creating in which you're using the beneficial bacteria from your compost and just enhancing their growth. So you can add that as a fertilizer, as a natural fertilizer, I would say, to your plants. So earlier when we were talking about having, why this is so good for people who love plants is because, well, you don't need to buy anything. You already have your own liquid fertilizer if you have a vermicompost bin. It's a very easy process. You literally want to dilute maybe like, 1 little cup of your compost with a liter of water, but you have to make sure that you give it some oxygen. So if you have an old fish tank or any sort of water pump, make sure that you just add that water pump inside. So it'll kind of bubble some oxygen inside. Make sure that you only get the best kind of bacteria. The worst thing you could do is shut this close, have no oxygen in the bin, and then you get the worst kind of bacteria, the anaerobic bacteria. So those that live without oxygen to breed. And if you add that to your plants, it could actually do the opposite effect. It could damage them. But obviously, there are always good ways to do things. And so that's why I recommend either you have a water pump or you kind of just mix it every few hours. Just take the bin or that you put your compost tea in and just put it into another bin. You're kind of just adding oxygen every time you do that process, right? In the same way that some people would do with wine. And that way you just get the best of the best. I will warn you though, there could be some things that happen to your vermicompost bin, such as having uninvited guests. And you don't want those because you want the worm party to keep going. Some of those could be the fruit flies. So if you already have maybe a little presence of fruit flies in your apartment, you need to be careful with your vermicompost bin. Because if you have any fruit or vegetable at the top layer of your bin and you keep your bin open, that's the perfect spot for a fruit fly to go, have some larvae and reproduce. So that's something you want to completely avoid. And the easiest way to do that is to always feed them by digging a little hole in the soil and adding the food, right? And you make sure that the food is well under the soil, the fruit flies have no access to that. And there's no way that they're going to be able to get there. So even if you might have a few fruit flies in your apartment before making your vermicompost bin, they won't be able to use the vermicompost bin as a habitat. So that's super important. And that also helps for smells. So you can imagine that having, just food on the top layer of your vermicompost bin could be a little bit, well, not so nice because then literally the food's out there and might produce some smells. Again, if you put it under the soil, you will not smell it at all, like zero. You'll be quite surprised by how little it smells. And when you do, once that food does get converted into better soil, you'll be surprised by that really like strong oxygenated smell that the soil gets. So imagine when you go into a forest and you get like that really rich, like oxygen rich smell, you can get the same thing in your vermicompost bin if you're managing it properly. Now, again, here I'm talking about bad smells. That's probably the thing that, people who manage the bin incorrectly will notice. It usually comes out of a lack of oxygen or having too much of a damp environment. So what you want to do is stop adding food. You want to water less, and you want to keep the bin slightly open. That's just so there's more air that can circulate, and the smell will leave as in a few days if you take those 3 actions. Any questions here, Malcolm?
I have a
Is he
question.
writing? Yes.
um, do you have any advice on how to get rid of fruit flies by any chance?
Like at home?
Yeah.
For sure. There's different ways you can make like little traps. So you could use and say you take a glass, you put some apple vinegar in the bottom, and then you can it's hard to describe, but you would basically take a piece of paper, make it like a V cone shape with a very small hole at the beginning, but a really wide opening. And the fruit flies will literally, be attracted to the smell, go inside. But once they're inside the cup, chances are they won't find their way back out.
Like a crab
So
trap.
yeah, exactly. And
Pretty
if
cool.
you have fruit flies and we want to get rid of it, that's probably the best way. Have like 2 or 3 in the spots where they tend to accumulate the most. Eventually, you won't have any more because they'll all want to go down there. Also, having some leftover wine instead of the apple vinegar, or having a leftover like beer, they love that. So that's
Good to know.
yeah. If it's something that happens, but look online. There's like so many other ways to do that. That's just like the most student friendly way because.
That was an off-topic question. I apologize.
That's
I have
fine.
another off-topic question for you, just a bit off-topic. So you mentioned anaerobic bacteria.
Yeah.
And I just want to, is it the same effect that's happening? Like, you ever seen people put like a plant in a jar with a certain amount of water and soil, and then they close it shut, but it's a see-through, so it creates its own like ecosystem in the bottle.
Oh yeah, I see what you mean.
Yeah. But that's not creating anaerobic bacteria, right? Because the plant is creating oxygen as long as there's sunlight.
I mean, those, if they're done well, they are closed loop systems that manage themselves. So I wouldn't have to worry with that per se. It's more, I haven't checked those systems out, but from what I understand, yes, they would be a closed loop system, and that's what permits them to, be able to live if you have a big one for like, over 20 something years.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't researched them yet, but that could be something that could be worthy for a workshop, or sorry, for research first and trying it out, and then maybe a workshop. I think that's one of the really cool things to have at home if you have the possibility to do so.
And just a clarification for me. You said bad smells. It could either come from lack of oxygen or not enough or too much water.
Too much water, yeah.
Too much water.
Or like lack of oxygen, too much water, too much food. Because food will mainly have like produce nitrogen, which is what basically one of the nutrients that the plants need. So in their decomposition, that's what they're kind of going to be producing, and that could lead to like bad smells. But if you balance that out with some carbon elements, so that could be pieces of shredded cardboard, leaves, anything that's brown material, basically that will be able to kind of balance it off. That is something that I forgot actually to mention in the food that you're giving them, is
just
that
a quick reminder of the time.
Perfect. How much time do we have?
It's 43 right now. So.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. This is the end. So we have like 2 slides left. This is a little something here that I want you all to do. It's the Ecology pledge. If you want to have a vermicompost bin, it's super important that you, say these 2 things here and that you respect them. So the first is, I will not bring my worms to a forest. It's super important you do so because forests have their own systems, and worms can actually be bad for forests if they're introduced. And that's the reason why, is because worms tend to be such good nutrient cycle masters that they tend to disturb the slower pace of the forest, and that will affect the bottom vegetation basically of the forest floor, and result overall in bigger changes in terms of what kind of insects are able to live there, and therefore what kind of birds. And you're basically, making a disturbance from the bottom that's changing the whole pyramid. So I'd really recommend, please do not bring worms to a forest. Don't just dump them out if your vermicompost has failed. You can add them to your garden soils, but do not add them to a forest. Okay, please do that for me and for the rest of all the ecologists behind this. And then the second thing is, I will respect the life I have committed to nurture. If you having worm compost bin is like having a pet. They are living beings, which means, take care of them, make sure that they are healthy, that they are doing well. And if there was a moment where you had too much of a life crisis and couldn't do well, that's fine. But give them the most love you can, and they will also give you the best love as well, with the best soil afterwards. And that's the end of my presentation. So again, thanks for listening. And both our worms here are super happy to have gone through this. If there are any last questions, I may go ahead. If not, we can also just close this here.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Hey, no worries. This was lots of fun. Hope you guys had interesting information, and we'll be posting some more information on basically how to have a vermicompost bin and maybe enter a contest to win some.
Yes, contest to win some. All right, guys. Ciao.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for listening. Take care.